Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Explore Nutanix's Hyperconverged Infrastructure, Features, and Tools. Our speaker today is Ken Willard. Ken specializes in system virtualization and consolidation at both the server and desktop level, helping technology teams approach virtualization while considering the technical, organizational, and political impact. Ken has worked with IT organizations from the commercial, government, and nonprofit verticals, addressing the virtualization in each of these unique environments. In addition to delivering training to both the business partner and end user communities, Ken has also worked with the tech data channel community to assist with pre-sale consulting. Very impressively, since 2016, Ken has delivered over 50 Nutanix training events to nearly 500 students. Now, before we get started with today's webinar, I want to talk about the functionalities of this platform. As mentioned during the webinar, everyone's microphones will be muted. So if you have any questions, I want to encourage you to post them in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. You should see a small Q&A icon at the bottom toolbar of your screen. We'll have a dedicated question answer session at the end of the presentation, but don't hesitate to post your questions as soon as they come up. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we're going to send a copy out to everyone either by the end of this week or early next week. And stick around till the end of the session where I will share a special promo which can save you some money on your Nutanix training. All right, you can take it away, Ken.
Michelle, thank you very much. Fantastic introduction there, and you actually pulled out some stats that I wasn't aware of so far as the training events. So that was kind of a cool number for me to hear. Well, welcome everybody. We're going to talk about just a little tiny bit on the front end here about hyperconverged in general, sort of where that's starting to fit into the data center today. And obviously, primary emphasis on this conversation is around the Nutanix hyperconverged offering overall. So we'll talk specifically what they have in what we think about as their Prism or their AOS environment. And then we get into some of the other products that sort of wrap around that, what makes up the entire family of the Nutanix offering. And then finally, a bit of a live demo at the end. Just in case you've not already had a chance to look at or work with the Nutanix user interfaces, we want to show you a little bit of Prism Element, which is their management interface that has the scope of a single cluster from the hyperconverged standpoint, and then their single pane of glass management tool that is called Prism Central, and that is intended to be a multi-cluster management architecture. So if we look at really how things have sort of evolved, right? As IT in the data center has changed, you go back to the 90s, it was a very client-server focused model, and that had some particular drawbacks, most notably often in efficiency and utilization and return on investment from IT dollars spent. We had this idea of one server, one OS, and one application due to potential interaction between applications if we tried to run multiples on the single host. If one of them had an issue and crashed, it was likely to take down the entire underlying OS, so that meant we lost multiple applications. And so it was a pretty inefficient model. And when folks started looking at virtualization and we were doing virtualization and consolidation assessments and impact assessments, we were finding pretty consistently that folks were using, on an average, something between 4 and 8% of the CPU in an individual server. And from a RAM perspective, generally somewhere between 60 and 70% of the memory installed in a particular server. So even if you just take the high water mark from the memory perspective, 70% utilization. If you want to sort of compare that to something that you live and work with every day, it would be about like buying a gallon of milk, drinking 70% of it, taking that 30% that remains, pour it down the drain and go get another gallon of milk. And that's kind of what we were doing from the physical server perspective in the 90s. Of course, we start seeing in the late 90s, early 2000s, the introduction of virtualization. VMware really starts to make a presence in the data center for themselves, and we see those utilization rates go up on our server infrastructure. We now have a secure way to run multiple workloads on a single piece of hardware, and that gives us much better financial ROI when we think about the server component of what's going on in the data center. But the back end of that is often very complex. We've got multi-tier storage architectures, right? What we consider that traditional 3-tier storage architecture. It means different skill sets. We have different teams operating and managing within the data center with different capabilities, different workflows, different ways to evaluate their success. And we all know, frankly, when it comes to the data center, the human capital is more often the most expensive part of the data center equation. And so while we got some good economic improvements with virtualization, we really didn't start to capitalize and make things as efficient as possible until we started looking at some shifts that were happening. When we think about the cloud generation, and that was really sort of founded with the likes of Amazon and Google, frankly, to start with. And then we saw organizations like Facebook start to come into the environment, and they needed to run their back-end infrastructures in a way that was completely different from what we thought about as traditional IT data centers. The concept of something called web scale architecture came into being. And it was a different way to consider resiliency and availability and scalability decisions. And how do you make that work in these massive architectures? And so out of that came obviously cloud deployments from Google Cloud Platform to Amazon Web Services. We see Azure referenced up here. If you're running global operations, today you're probably thinking about the Alibaba Cloud in the Asia Pacific region, right? We now have these global architectures. And because of that, we've now got a different way that we're starting to think about not only what we do from public-facing cloud deployed applications to our own on-premises operations. When we think about what happened with the web scale approach, right, it meant that we had very, very small slices of compute. We had extremely resilient software and physical architectures. No single point of failure. Always on environments. And the idea was to build that scale and that resiliency needed a little bit of a different way to look at that, maybe sometimes from the hardware perspective. Instead of partnering with some of the traditional hardware vendors, we all know that Facebook and Google started with off-the-shelf sort of generic x86 hardware. Amazon's taken that a step further, right? They've got their Nitro system, which is unbranded by any of the big hardware vendors, but built to very specific specifications, right? But no special purpose environments. All of the intelligence, all of the management, all the capabilities built into the software. So if I want to upgrade a component, or I want to upgrade a process or a behavior in my data center infrastructure, I don't have to worry about, do I have to swap out a piece of hardware to make that work? I rewrite the software and the capabilities there. All right, so it gives us a whole new way to look at operations. And this was originally reserved just for those big cloud vendors. They were the folks that were thinking about this. But then that idea started to trickle down. What if we could run traditional corporate or company-owned IT operations the same way that we saw these big cloud providers delivering web scale infrastructure? And that's where a lot of us are today. A lot of organizations are on the road to that completely software-defined sort of approach, where, to be blunt, the hardware is a commodity, and I don't really care what it is, and the power the controls and the intelligence all lie in the software. And if I want to change a function, change a security policy, implement a new approach to something, it's a software level change. All right, so when we think about that specifically as it relates to Nutanix, we start to think about how we get the environment capable of supporting that. In most cases, our traditional three-tier architectures are not going to lend themselves well to that sort of a software-driven approach. Right? So we want to modernize with a hyper-converged platform. That gives us the underpinnings to be able to start to build an enterprise cloud. And we're thinking about that now from an on-premises perspective, right? Why do we call it a cloud? It's all about the management, right? How do we deploy resources? How do we manage them through their life cycle? And then for some of you, that may mean we're going to bridge that into a multi-cloud architecture where part of the application, the architecture runs on premises and part of it runs in one of the public cloud providers. But that's not a requirement, right? What we're really thinking about is making sure that we can help you get to this stage so that you've got that responsiveness, flexibility, and no single point of failure. Right, especially when we think about when most of us have our environments today. Traditional three-tier architecture, lots of vendors to integrate, lots of vendor-specific configurations and models that we need to implement, right? It's time-consuming on the upfront. Most of you probably have project teams, or if you don't have project teams, at a minimum, you've got an Excel spreadsheet that lays out everything you got to do when you start thinking about a new deployment, right? It is a big process to get new hardware and new architecture deployed in the data center today as a general rule. And when we think about especially those traditional three-tier architectures, they're challenging to maintain over their life cycle, especially because we're talking about now multi-vendor deployments with interdependencies. It's really tough sometimes to do the troubleshooting. Lots of planning has to go into upgrade operations to make sure that upgrading one part, one component of the system doesn't break something else, right? And we talked about, I mentioned earlier, in most cases, the most expensive asset in the data center is the human capital, right? Us, the people that make the data center do what it needs to do. And when we're in heavy multi-vendor integrated environments, folks, we wind up spending most of our time on care and feeding of that environment instead of figuring out new ways to deliver a service better, make an app perform faster, make things better integrated, right? No time for innovation and creativity because we're spending all of our time in care and feeding operations. So the idea behind what we're thinking about today, particularly with Hyperconverged and the Nutanix vision for how that rolls out, is really this idea of bringing the cloud operationally, management, design principles, and bringing those on premises inside the corporate data center. So all of the things that we think about that Google, Facebook, and Amazon really pioneered, how do we bring that into our on-premises operations? Faster deployments, grow as we need, simplified management. By the way, you notice I skipped actually saying the phrase one-click operation. I don't know about you, but I've never used a single software product that one click actually did anything for me, right? But simplified operations, cleaner workflows, unified workflows. So that's what we get with the Nutanix environment. And the foundation of this is, and you've probably seen the branding, right? The Acropolis OS. Well, honestly, folks, the Acropolis OS is just a set of services that run on every node of a Nutanix cluster and give us things like data services and the hardware integration and the administrative controls all in one user interface. So let's look at how this starts to come together. When we think about traditional three-tier architecture, you've got some makeup of disk in the back end, and that's generally presented out for redundancy through a two-controller model. Limits us a bit on scalability. Those two controllers, that's generally all we're ever going to get out of a chassis. And so if those two controllers together can generate 100,000 IOPS, that's great. But then as we start to add more and more servers, more and more nodes that connect and communicate to those two controllers, we start to carve up that resource. When you look at hyperconverged, we take away the three-tier part of the storage architecture, and we fold that into local storage. Right, and let's be clear, this is not a Nutanix specific concept. This is the idea that we get when we talk hyperconverged in general. And so I now have local disk, very good performance. And then this is where the Nutanix specific piece starts to come into play. With Nutanix, we have what we call a controller VM. And those controllers, the two that we used to see on the external storage arrays, right, I now get one of those controllers for every node in the cluster. Now my limited 100,000 IOPS that I had in an external storage enclosure, well, now guess what? Every time I add a new node, I'm adding a new storage processor or a new storage controller. I'm getting the ability to scale my disk throughput performance as I scale the number of nodes that need to talk to that disk. And so this lets me be able to start small, build as I need, right? Not pay for a lot of additional resource in advance. And if you've read much about Nutanix, you know that we have the idea of data locality, which optimizes the communications. These VMs that are running on a particular node, we optimize the storage to keep their data local to that node with resiliency, redundant copies distributed throughout other nodes in the cluster, so we don't have a single point of failure. And this gives us the ability then, as we need to grow over time, we can mix different sizes, different types of nodes, nodes that have different storage capacities, nodes that are storage only or compute only, depending on the kind of workloads we need to run in our environment. Gives us an extremely flexible, scalable, redundant architecture. So when we think about this, we've now got a great way to glue everything together, that Acropolis OS. And that gives us all of those operational flexibility pieces. But how do we start to pull this together from an administrative perspective? And that's where Prism comes in. Prism really simplifies our operations. Right, we've got a full stack of management analytics built right in, all HTML5 driven. So really fast, clean, highly compatible in how we access that. We get great analysis on a per entity basis. So here we're looking at specifics around a particular virtual machine. Right? We've selected the VM in the top, and then in the bottom, we get all of the details. Right? What is it doing from a CPU standpoint? What is it doing from a memory standpoint? Right? What kind of I/O is it driving through the infrastructure? Really good analytics. The ability to graphically look at what's going on cluster-wide. So in this case, we're looking at the diagram view of the hardware that makes up our cluster. We see each node represented in the top, and then that cluster-wide metric view at the bottom. Similar kind of view from storage. The other thing is, if you've done any looking at Nutanix, you know this is our main pull down. And under that, we have things like the storage administration, the virtual machine administration, and each one of those categories has its own dashboard, which gives you a very quick summary view of what's going on in relationship to that component or that aspect of your infrastructure. And then we can start to drill down, looking at the specifics of alerts and events going on in the environment. How healthy is the cluster? How healthy are my VMs? Do I have configuration concerns that I need to be drilling into? Right, all presented in a very clean format. And then, of course, a couple of the other things that you've probably seen in other Nutanix conversations is the ability to do some forward-looking. Right? I know I've got a certain amount of projects that have been deployed. We've had a busy season this quarter so far as new VMs and new resources being consumed. Given what's been going on, where am I on a runway perspective? Am I about to have a problem with CPU capacity or disk capacity? Right? Lets me have those forward-looking analytics as well. From a troubleshooting perspective, some great graphics tools to start to map details, particularly as it relates to networking, one of the most critical parts of your data center infrastructure. And so we can see VMs running as they connect through the virtual network infrastructure of the host that they're running out to the physical switch infrastructure in your top of rack environment. And depending on the team that manages your physical switch infrastructure, how frankly flexible they are, what they'll give you, right? If we can get CDP or LLDP turned on, we can get some great metrics back with either of those protocols. And then if I want to even look at some specific performance throughput on individual ports, if we can get SNMP data, I can pull all of that back and present it in these graphic elements right in the cluster management tools. Right, so great resources from the overall management. So one of the value propositions, what we were just talking about, is the idea of not having traditional external storage cabinets and a 3-tier storage architecture. And you're scratching your head and going, well, yeah, but I've got some fantastic tools in that external cabinet, right? It'll do deduplication, it'll do compression. I can replicate that cabinet from my Cleveland data center to my Omaha data center for disaster recovery. And I don't really want to give up all of those enterprise class data services. Right? That is part of the core behavior of that Acropolis OS. Those things that we think about from core data services, in storage, snapshotting and cloning, intelligent data tiering, I mentioned compression, dedupe, right? All of those types of things, as well as the ability to replicate to other locations if we need to. All native behaviors of that Acropolis OS, what's running your Nutanix clusters. In addition to that, we also all know how critical security is in the data center today. Ongoing threats, new day zero events are a constant part of our lives. So the Nutanix environment is very resilient. We've got some great configurable options around data security. But folks, I think the biggest one is the self-healing aspect of this. Right? There is a security management and automation tool set that is part of a Nutanix cluster deployment. And you can enable that, and it will then at regular intervals, hourly, daily, weekly, depending on your industry, what your threat response profiles need to be, those kinds of things, it will scan your cluster and ensure standard configurations, proper security policies down to the ability to verify proper file level permissions on key system files in the Nutanix architecture. We can do that at that controller VM layer. And if you're running the Acropolis hypervisor, the Nutanix native hypervisor, we can do that at the underlying hypervisor as well. So extremely powerful storage and security management. All right, so when we think about this, primarily today we're seeing folks that talk about the choice of hypervisor. Right, that's one of the great things about this. Nutanix Hyperconverged at its core is a storage platform. It is a hyperconverged platform. And with that, you could be running traditional Hyper-V if you've got an investment in Hyper-V in your data center already, traditional ESXi if that's your hypervisor of choice. You don't have to replace the virtualization layer. But we are seeing many organizations choose the Nutanix native Acropolis hypervisor. With the Acropolis hypervisor, it's a variant of KVM. They started with KVM and built some of their own services and operations into it. It natively obviously ties into both the Prism Element and Prism Central administrative panels. And folks, one of the biggest things is when you select the Acropolis hypervisor, your virtual networking becomes Open Virtual Switch. And that lets you then start to implement things like microsegmentation and service chaining. And I think from a security standpoint today, microsegmentation is one of the most critical things that should be implemented in every data center. You'll hear it referred to as microsegmentation. You'll hear it referred to as a zero trust data center model. It is the idea that just because something exists behind our perimeter firewall doesn't mean that it should be talking to everything in the data center. There's no reason for my public web-facing servers to have full unrestricted access to my financial accounting package running in the same data center. There might be some very specific API calls that it's allowed to make for account lookups and billing charges and those kinds of things, but it shouldn't have full unrestricted access. And with microsegmentation, we can do that. The other big thing is service chaining, leveraging our vendor partner relationship. So if you're using Palo Alto or Fortinet for some of your data center networking security, we can leverage those products and tie them in using the service chain model under network function virtualization. The other great thing about this from a management perspective is this idea of full lifecycle management. We talked about several of these, right? Scaling as we need, very easy to deploy, great management infrastructure. About to get into the live demo here in just a minute, so we'll get to see some of those. But folks, I think the biggest thing, and I always poke fun every time I see a one-click upgrade, because you don't execute a process in one click, but their resources are very good for management. And we've got a single management infrastructure to do everything from upgrading the firmware on hardware components through our hypervisor up into that Acropolis operating system itself. And if you're running any of the other resources that Nutanix needs, or that you want to deploy into Nutanix, things like Nutanix files, objects, Carbon, right? I have one lifecycle manager that can see and administer all of those upgrade tracks. So I very quickly want to touch on some of the other things actually that I was just mentioning. This conversation around hyperconverged is really about the core Nutanix cluster architecture, Acropolis OS for operations, and Prism for management. But folks, there's an awful lot more to the Nutanix family. We have Nutanix volumes. If you have a use case for iSCSI communication, You have external systems that could leverage iSCSI endpoints. And so you could have an external bare metal system to run and connect to data sets on your distributed storage fabric. Nutanix Volumes will do that. If you are looking to have a redundant, easy to manage file server infrastructure that deploys on top of that distributed file system from Nutanix, Files. Buckets. Buckets give us an Amazon S3 API compliant object store. And what do you do with an object store? Folks, anytime you've got, we generally think of object stores for large data sets that need to be archived for a long time. It's a very efficient methodology for storing those things. So security video is a big topic there. Large graphics and video rendering operations. If you've got a marketing team that produces those kinds of images, great use case for buckets. We can also, with buckets, impose lifecycle management. So if you have to retain documents, images, video files for a certain number of years for audit compliance, buckets gets you to that type of capability. Calm and Flow. I want to talk about sort of side by side here. Calm is the Nutanix Application Lifecycle Manager. It lets us configure, and when we say application in this sense, we don't mean a VM. We're thinking about those rich, multi-part applications where you've got a database server, probably talking to some kind of an application server, maybe a couple of application servers that are front-ended by a load balancer. Building those deployments, setting up the communication rules, making sure they are patched and secured properly. A lot of work. We can manage all of that through a single workflow in Calm and make sure that we have consistent deployment of those types of applications. And the reason I said I want to talk about Calm and Flow together, Flow is the Nutanix microsegmentation, actually it's their Nutanix network virtualization management, which gives us microsegmentation. Right? It lets us set up those security rules of these systems should be talking to each other, these systems should not talk to the rest of the world. Right? This is my HR resources, and I want them isolated from everything else in production. I can do that from a networking perspective with Flow. And then the last one, Carbon up here. For those of you that you have development teams, you're probably having conversations. Things are moving from what we would think about traditional monolithic applications using a waterfall development methodology. Folks, we know that's all moving to a microservices approach for most software development today. Fast turnaround, fast changes, independent isolated code pieces that just make calls to each other. Carbon is the Nutanix distribution of a Kubernetes container management environment, completely Kubernetes certified. So just a few things that make up sort of that overall product family from Nutanix. All right, we promised you, want to get jumped over here, do a little bit of a live demo with everybody, just show you some of the features and functionalities here. So you notice I've got some multiple tabs open. Let me kind of walk you through what we've got set up for the demo today. I have a Prism Central deployment. Again, Prism Central is that centralized single pane of glass intended to manage multiple clusters. And then that is currently managing and talking to a couple of individual clusters or Prism element deployments. I've got a lab cluster A and a lab cluster B. And so in this example, lab cluster A is our production work cluster. This is kind of how we've got this set up for the demo. And we'll let that load. You can see I've got some VMs deployed out here. Frankly, 3 of those are just our controller VMs that are showing up in inventory. But I've got some other example VMs out here already up and running, doing some work for us. And then I've got Lab Cluster B. And you may not necessarily have this exact kind of architecture in your environment, but for us, for this demo, Lab Cluster B is our management cluster, right? Smaller resourcing, just basically at this point, it's running our Prism Central VM for us, and it's acting as our backup target for our DR example when we do the demo here. But other than that, you may not have that architecture. You may not have a dedicated management cluster. We just happen to set that up for the purpose of the demo. You'll notice that on the Prism element main dashboard of each of the independent clusters, they acknowledge that they are connected directly to the Prism Central management platform. And if I go to the main dashboard here, we get that same Prism Central communication verification. One of the first things I want to do is start to generate some workload for us in one of our VMs so that we can take a look at what happens in some of the charting and those types of things. So I'm going to, in Prism Central, pull down, and you'll hear a couple of references to that. Let me close that up for a second. All right, so you see the three parallel lines there. The sort of official name for that is the entities menu. The unofficial name, but far more common, is called the hamburger menu. I've also heard tell that there are other vendors that have similar looking menus that call them the pancake stack menu. However you want to think about it. All right, if you want to call it entities or you want it to be food related, absolutely. I'm going to go under virtual infrastructure, pick my VMs. And at this point, since I've got two clusters that are associated with my Prism Central management environment, I'm going to see all of the VMs from both clusters. And so I want to clean this up. This is a little busy for me. So one of the things that I want to do is just go up here to the grouping options, and let's just group these by cluster so I can get a sense of what's running where. Right? That makes a little more sense to me. That's a little easier to get my brain around. Now, the other thing that we want to make sure that we're doing, let's go ahead down here to this finance database, and let's get that powered up. Obviously, we want to power up the database before I start to power up the finance app here in a minute. The other thing I want to work on is this CentOS 7 VM. I've got a little batch job over there I want it to run to start generating some disk access for us. So a couple ways I could do this, right? I could simply select it, and then under actions, I could launch the console for that. But in this case, I'm actually going to click through on its name and just get a little more look at what kind of metrics I get back in the Prism Central view. All right, I can see sort of how it's running from an operational standpoint. This happens to be on a network where I'm not doing IP address assignment, so when it tried its DHCP request, it didn't get one, right? I didn't give it an IP address. I can see it's not doing a whole lot of work over here, running absolutely no disk utilization at the moment. We're about to fix that. So I'm going to launch the console for this VM. Get logged in here. It's going to work better if I type the password correctly. There we go. And so all I've done is I've just started a little script that's going to sit here in the background for us and write some miscellaneous data to the disk. I just really want it doing some work so that we can see the I/O performance and the I/O mapping. All right, so I'm going to close that, let that go ahead and sit and run in the background, start to spin up some resources. I'm going to go back to my VMs view, and I'm going to trust that my finance database is online and running. And so now I'm going to go ahead and power up that finance app VM as well. And since the finance audit VM really kind of stands on its own, we're going to power that one on so that we've got it running when we get down to the next part of the demo. And so for that next part, what I want to look at is one of the data integrity, data protection tools. So under data protection, I've already set up today, we've got a finance apps data protection group. Logical structure lets me pull interrelated VMs together. And in this case, we're doing two things with them. We're taking what's called local snapshots. That means that I have near line storage, traditional storage layer snapshots. For those of you coming at this from a VMware perspective, be very clear. Nutanix native snapshots have absolutely nothing to do with vSphere-based snapshots. They are two different management functions. When we take snapshots in Nutanix, that is a storage tier snapshot event. All right, so if I take a look, if I click on my finance apps and I go in and say I want to update it, I can see how I've got this configured. Right now, it houses my finance app database and application server. And that's taking a snapshot every hour. Locally, I'm keeping the last 6, right? Very near line, so that if something happens and I need to recover that, it's nearly instantaneous. But the other thing I want to do is, what happens if something catastrophic happens at my primary data center? I lose power. Somebody cuts through the fiber link with a backhoe, those kinds of things. I'm also replicating to the remote site, Lab Cluster B, and I'm keeping the last 48 hours worth, just to make sure that if something goes wrong, I've got a little layer of protection. I could either then fail that over at the remote site, or if I needed to, I could just recover one of those instances from the remote site and maybe do some manual data recovery. In a couple of ways that could happen. If I look at the remote site and I go under data protection, go to the table view. In this case, I can see I've got that same finance apps data protection group. And if I scroll down, I see the mode for this is inactive. Right? Well, what does that mean? That means that the VMs are inactive on the failover site. They're in the condition to have inbound replication jobs update their disk state. And if I keep scrolling on down here, right, I can see that I've had the last incoming replication happen just a little bit ago. And if I go look at the local snapshots, right, what do I have on my remote site? Well, we fired off 3 different intervals this morning, right, at that 1 hour interval window. So the other thing I want to demo, we powered up and we added the audit VM to my finance group of resources. But that audit VM, the application for that was purchased and brought in after we already had our data protection set up. Easy enough, right? I'm back on Lab Cluster A, my primary site. I'm going to update my protection domain. And it now shows me a list of all the VMs on the primary site that are not already protected. And so now I can simply pick that audit VM, scroll down here to the bottom, and move that over to the protected entities inventory. And so now the next time this job runs, it will not only back up the finance database and application server, but my audit server as well. Right, really nice, clean management there. Folks, if you've been looking at this, the other thing that you know is Nutanix has a fantastic channel partner relationship around DR specifically. So Veeam, Haiku, Rubrik, right? If you're already using one of those other third-party products to do your backups, and your disaster planning and failover activities. All of those integrate natively into Nutanix. If you don't already have one of those, you have this tool set ready to go. The one thing I want to demo, because we're sort of pushing up on the time limit here, but I want to talk about one of the things that I think is a really powerful feature when you're using the Acropolis hypervisor. We often have a scenario where we might need to share disks between virtual machines or between, say, a virtual machine and an outside bare metal system. Think about this anytime there's a cluster environment going on, right? Database cluster, some application that you're running that is natively clustered or can do native clustering at the application tier. And in that case, I probably need some kind of a shared quorum disk, probably need a shared data disk, maybe a shared logs drive. And I want to be able to present that maybe to VMs on the cluster, or maybe to a VM on the cluster and a bare metal system outside. The way we can do that very cleanly through Nutanix is to use the volume group architecture. This is native to every Nutanix cluster, regardless of your license level. Right, so I add a new volume group, and I'm going to call this my finance shared disks. Then I go in and add a new disk. I can pick which container this is going to live on. Really important tool there, because your containers are where you define your data services. So is a container running compression? Is it running deduplication? Those types of things. Think about a modern database application. Right? All the modern databases run their own compression algorithms. So I would certainly not want to build a disk for a database engine on a compressed volume. I'm now paying that compression tax twice. But my log volume for that database, well, what are logs? Flat text. Those compress really, really well. Right? So even within a single volume group, if I had multiple containers with different policies, I could build my different disks on different containers and thereby deliver the right storage policies. All right, so I just added a single disk of 20 gig. Let's add another one. Let's say this is going to be the database volume. We'll make it 50 gig. Again, I'm going to put that on the default container. And then let's just say I need a little tiny quorum disk out here. And so we'll just make a little one that's 5 gig for my quorum disk. And so I now have a single volume group managing 3 logical disk entities. And I can save that. And then I can shift over to my virtual machines view. And with the Nutanix hypervisor, this is a Nutanix hypervisor specific feature, but I can go into my finance app virtual machine now, update that VM, and I can scroll down. Well, that is not being very cooperative. Come on now. There we go. And add the volume group I just created, finance shared disks. And so now without configuring iSCSI in the virtual machine, I have just delivered it access to those 3 shared disks in the volume group. And then if the other half of that cluster companion pair was a bare metal server, I could enable the iSCSI support services and share those same 3 disks to an external system via iSCSI and through the Nutanix Acropolis hypervisor natively to that VM on the same service. Since I don't have an external bare metal system to demo, I'll show that with just going into the finance VM, another VM on the same host. I'm going to update that VM. Go down to my volume groups again, say add a volume group, pick the same one. And just that easily, I've now mapped those 3 shared disks to 2 VMs in my environment. Very simple, very powerful. Folks, the other thing to think about though with that, and I can't stress this enough, we hammered this pretty hard in the class, that is an open disk share, right? We're not doing any on-disk locking, no error checking. If you do this architecture, it means that something at the application tier has cluster services built in, and it has to understand how to properly share those disks across the 2 cluster members. All right, so that runs us up to just a few minutes before the top of the hour. Thoughts, comments, things that you want to get into the discussion here? I know we had a quick question about the recorded options, which we've already gotten answered. Anything from the Nutanix family? Questions about Acropolis operations, anything like that?
While we wait for some questions to come in, I would like to use this time to talk about that promo that I teased early on. But before I do that, thank you so much, Ken. Very informative session. Another reminder that we are sending a copy of the recording out to everyone. That'll be sent out by email. All right, let's talk about promos. I am so excited to share that we are offering a 10% discount on our Nutanix Enterprise Cloud Administration class, as well as the Nutanix Advanced Administration and Performance Management class. So this promo will run from now through December 31st. There is a unique promo code, which Ken is sharing on his screen, and I will also post in the chat for everyone. I would also like to invite you over to our website, exitcertified.com, to see the current schedule of those Nutanix classes, some more details about the promo, and just to learn more about us. So let me post the promo details in the chat window for everyone.
Michelle, while you're posting those, let me do a little bit of expectation setting, I think, maybe around the 2 courses. Folks, if you've been in the IT industry for a while, but you have not necessarily been working with Nutanix, I would maybe caution you against jumping right into the advanced management and performance class. We've had that happen with some folks in the past. I get it. You're seasoned, you've been in the data center for a while, you don't want to start with an intro course. But what happens is with that advanced administration class, the curriculum is written and it says very clearly in the course description, you come into this with either the ECA course already under your belt or about 6 months of experience with Nutanix. Folks, that class is a very interesting and very good structure. It's 4 days, 8 modules. For each module, we have an hour of discussion and topic presentation and 3 hours of lab. And then we take a lunch break and we come back and we do an hour of the next topic and put you back into 3 hours of lab. It is extremely hands-on and it is extremely intense. And if you don't have a little bit of background with the Nutanix platform overall, you're going to have a kind of rough 4 days, personal opinion. I teach that one a lot.
So I don't have a question, but I think this is a nice kudos to you, Ken. Michael found this session very informative, great overview of Nutanix, and said that he'll be watching the recording more than once. So I think that's fantastic.
Thank you.
Our session may have been just so thorough that there are no follow-up questions, but we do have some time, so we'll continue to stay here. So do feel free to post any questions. In the meantime, I am just going to stop the recording now. So once again, thank you so much, Ken, for your time and for everyone for joining us today.